Hello, welcome to Databite 165, Mental Health Chatbots and the Future of Care. I'm Livia Garofalo, a researcher at Data and Society on our Trustworthy Infrastructures team.
And I am Briana Vecchione. I am a researcher with the AI on the ground team at Data and Society, and we will be your moderators for today's conversation. This event is supported by our associate producer, Tunika Onekikami, and senior producer, Rigoberto Lara from Data and Society's events team as well. And for those joining Data and Society events for the first time, Data and Society is an independent research and policy institute studying the social implications of data and automation. So our organization produces original research and regularly convenes multidisciplinary thinkers to challenge the power and the purpose of technology in society. So today's conversation explores how the field of mental health has been fundamentally altered by a new infrastructure of intimacy and care, generative AI. A recent Stanford study estimates that roughly 25% of people in the United States have used large language models for mental health support, and Harvard Business Review ranked therapy and companionship as the #1 use case for generative AI in 2025. At the same time, case reports and lawsuits have documented tragic outcomes, which reliance on chatbots have been associated with severe psychiatric deterioration and even death. So for the past year, we've been engaged in research with people who use general purpose chatbots for socio-emotional and therapeutic purposes. They've shared with us how and why they use these tools, what they find helpful, what worries them, and what they would like to see in chatbot development, and what they fear might happen. In this conversation, we aim to go beyond these stories of industry hype and inevitable doom to instead offer more new and nuanced perspectives on how these technologies have become embedded in how people seek care and comfort and companionship. So while much of the discussion on AI and mental health rightly focuses on safety and guardrails, what's often overlooked are more the deeper implications for things like our sense of self, the way that we relate to each other and care for each other, particularly in a moment of escalating societal crisis. So these interrogatives require the expertise of people who are rarely in the same room, our panelists here, and these rooms even more rarely include the voices of people actively using these tools. So, and yet these stories are very critical to understanding people's lived experiences. So to help us answer these questions today, here are our speakers. Luca Belli is the AI safety lead at Spring Health and co-founded Twitter's machine learning ethics, transparency, and accountability team. Luca describes himself as the policy person in the tech discussion and the tech person in the policy one. And he bridges interests between research, engineering, product policy, and public interest outcomes. Miranda Bogen is the founding director of the AI Governance Lab at the Center for Democracy and Technology. An AI policy expert and responsible AI practitioner, Bogen has led work at the intersection of policy, AI fairness, and governance in senior roles in industry as well as civil society. And lastly, Marlynn Wei is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and author based in New York City. Integrating her background in law, ethics, and psychodynamic psychotherapy, she offers a clinical and ethical perspective on the emerging intersection of AI and mental health.
All right, let's get started. So maybe starting with Luca, then Miranda, then Marlene. I wonder if you can all briefly introduce yourselves and kind of tell us what part of this conversation around AI and mental health chatbots are you focused on, and what you're seeing sort of in your corner, in your field. So, Luca, take it away.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks for organizing this event, and thanks for everyone for coming. Um, I am Luca, and I'm the eye safety lead for Spring Health, and my work is mostly focused around measurement and what does it mean for an AI system to be safe, especially how do we translate or to be safe in the context of a conversation, and especially a conversation involving mental health. And especially how do we translate all the clinical safety concerns into, some sort of automated evaluation, and how do we make that a more precise science? Because currently I would say it's terrible and very vibe-based.
And I'm Miranda Bogen. I'm at CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology, and we're a civil rights and civil liberties organization focused on technology and those values in the digital age. And we've been thinking quite a bit about AI for a long time, from automated decision making to privacy, privacy implications of digital technologies, and now general purpose AI. And so we're thinking about that generally. What are practitioners doing to implement risk management, safeguards? How are they understanding what people value, and how are they building tools that support people not only in the US, but around the world, across languages, et cetera? How are they understanding risk, and what interventions will actually address those risks and what actually might not be effective in addressing those risks? So we're thinking about that generally. We've also dug into mental health a bit insofar as a similar topic to Luca mentioned. One of the main tools that AI developers use to understand their own systems and to understand their risks are measurements and evaluations. And so there are a couple of those that relate to mental health, and yet they're very surface level. They're still quite simplistic, lots of work being done to do better. But we did some work looking at eating disorders, which was underappreciated kind of in those areas, and interviewed practitioners who had expertise in eating disorders to try and tease out what would it look like to be more nuanced and understanding how things could be supportive or go wrong here, because we think getting to that level of detail is critical both in mental health but also in all of the other areas of potential use and harm, to really governing the technology and making sure it serves people and doesn't hurt them.
Marlynn?
I'm Marlynn Wei. I'm a psychiatrist and writer based in New York. And I recently testified in front of members of Congress a few months ago at the end of last year about the mental health risks of AI chatbots. And what I did was outline this 4-domain risk framework for them. And I would say both sides were very interested in trying to prevent harms and to balance the benefits and risks. And so the 4 domains are emotional dependence risks, reality testing, which you may have heard of in the headlines, AI psychosis, risks around crisis safety issues like suicidality, and 4th are the ethical and systemic issues like confidentiality and privacy. And what I tried to do also is to inform them about the different types of AI chatbots. So when we use that subheading, like what do we actually mean? Because the risks and benefits really vary based on the type. There are the general purpose ones that we know, ChatGPT, Claude, and then there's ones that are specifically designed by clinicians, and very few are clinically tested, things like Therabot that came out last year, and also ones that are specifically AI companions that are designed to engage and to create relationships. So I think just outlining that for people is helpful as a conversation. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Marlene, also for creating some of that distinction, right? Because people are using now a lot general purpose large language models, but they're, the field is quite crowded in that sense. And both Luca and Miranda, you brought up measurements and benchmarks, and I want to kind of go to Marlene and thinking about experience, right, of people using these tools. In our research that we've been doing, people are finding solace and benefit. They're finding companionship. They're finding advice. Some people are using it as a therapist because they can't afford one or because they don't want to talk to a provider. So I wonder if we could kind of touch upon the experiences that you're seeing and therapeutically what you're noticing.
Yeah, so it's in my practice, which specializes in therapy, a large number of people are using AI primarily for work and some for emotional support, but I have a selection bias because they have made for the emotional support piece. In the broad terms, in the US, we think between 25 to 50% of people are now using AI chatbots of some form, mostly general purpose ones, for emotional support, or what they call affective use. And largely people who are younger and may not have insurance or access to the therapist. There is a shortage in some areas, especially long wait times. So I would say it's important that we understand that while there are risks, there are benefits and opportunities here. But what's hard is that it really impacts the risks impact the most vulnerable. And I think that's what's most challenging. And what's also complicated is that empathy alone is not therapy. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And so some of the potential risks come from when AI chatbots are trying to be so helpful, but they might approach something with something like saying with certainty, like, you're going to be definitely okay, but that's not actually therapeutic. But I did work with like a young 28-year-old woman who had a history of trauma and did not have many friends and couldn't turn to her family. And she was using AI, was using ChatGPT quite heavily. And at first, it did alleviate some of the loneliness, but over time, she became a bit disillusioned with it and actually felt lonelier over time. So I think we should think about I think it's important for us to consider not the short-term benefit, but also the long-term impact on us.
Yeah, there's something else, and then we'll move to Luca, but I just wanted to ask something about shame, right? Shame and judgment is something that comes up in a lot of these conversations about why people are compelled to use these, and sometimes they will, prefer to talk to someone that is not a clinician for a variety of reasons. So I wonder what that tells us about, sense of self, but also about therapy itself, if you have any thoughts about that.
I think there is something different about when we speak with something that we can be fully anonymous versus knowing that it's a human on the other end. And so there's opportunities on both, but there is research that shows that sometimes we feel more comfortable disclosing and disclose more information to AI systems or AI chatbots compared to human therapists. There is an interesting study that showed, I just want to highlight a benefit, but the difference between human therapy versus AI systems. There's one where they gave an AI friend to about 100 women in Ukraine in an active war zone, and these women were experiencing active anxiety. And they found that the AI friend was able to reduce the anxiety for these women in about 30%. And they also compared this to a human therapist and found that it was able to reduce anxiety about closer to 45 to 50%. So you can see benefits, but you can also see the difference between human therapy versus an AI system.
And we see this as well as, oftentimes it's kind of used as a stopgap for, lack of traditional care resources for, like you said, marginalized folks. I want to turn to Luca a little bit. I know AI safety is a really nebulous term. We see that companies have various strategies around the level of commitment they have to safety versus the speed of AI model deployment. Earlier this week, we saw Anthropic announce that they're softening their AI safety practices so that they can stay competitive with other labs. But I think one of the things that's difficult to wrap our head around is actually seeing what AI safety looks like behind the scenes on the back end. And I'm wondering, as someone who works in AI safety, how do you see companies kind of operationalizing what AI safety means in practice? You mentioned, kind of vibe based, but can you ground that a little bit for us?
For sure, yeah. I would say, this is the $1 million question, but now $1 million is especially for AI companies, it's pocket change, right? So this is a very big question, and one of my many work pet peeve is, people throwing around words without really giving meaning to them. Especially the more something is general, the less you can really be specific by definition. And so I think everyone would want to have a general safety framework that, if you do these 5 things, then you're good. But I don't think that's possible. And, I would probably think it's counterproductive. And so in the work I've done, more recently, I work on this open source evaluation framework for chatbots called VeriMage, which is a way to exactly do what you're mentioning. So how do you operationalize safety, but not any safety? We, purposely scope it down a lot to societal ideation. And so how can we interact, or how we evaluate the interaction of a chatbot with a user who might be in distress, and how would we evaluate it? And so the way we've done it was, through I work with many of my colleagues who are therapists, and so we talk through what some of the current best practices are, which I also think it's a very interesting open question, because we know a lot of the best practices, in a sort of like human-human interaction, we don't know yet. I think there's still a lot of open question, like what does a best practice for a human chatbot interaction, right? And so even even, doing this work is like, we have an opinion of what we think a current best practice might be, but we also acknowledge that because of this technology, because of the usage is evolving so fast, so the evaluation have to evolve with them. And so it's perfectly fine that in a month or a year or whatever, we might change parts of all of it just because we have learned more from the usage. And I think, in a lot of the industries that people like to compare, say like, oh, air 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 travel, like that are very very sort of like safety oriented, people tend to forget it took them decades to arrive to that point, right? And so everyone wants to sort of like speed run this process, which is great, but part of that is, you know, part of the safety comes also from understanding and looking at the failure modes. Anyhow, so this is, I don't want to go on a tangent, but um, I think, to answer your question, and we had this rubric that the clinician were able to write it, and that is sort of the basis of like what a best practice response from a chatbot should look like, and then we evaluate how much the actual interaction diverges from that, and that is the way we were able to operationalize safety, scope down to sort of like risk of suicidal ideation.
Could I ask a follow-up, Luca?
Please.
One of the realities I think people are grappling with these chatbots is that the initial foray into dealing with safety was to look at the prompt that people give and then measure the response and whether that deviates from a set of norms or best practices. But obviously, with especially therapeutic conditions, people are engaging with these tools over time, not just like a few turns, but over a long period of time. So I'm curious how you and practitioners are thinking about that. How far along are folks in developing instruments to measure this in the longer run?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So at first, I also thought like, great, let's do a collection of prompts, see how they answer, and that's it, right? It's like, except per your point, that's not how mental health works, and you know, it's a conversation. And so the way we have done it was to consider a full conversation. So this is a multi-turn evaluation. And so that is what is sort of like evaluated. It's not a single interaction, especially because sometimes, things come later or, people open up a little later. However, I think, well, I'll mention that there is also the other part where it's like each conversation might look like that is okay, but the pattern over time might not be okay. And so I would say the work I've done focuses only on the conversation level for now. I've been thinking how to, because there's also this feedback loop of, the interaction between the person and the bot. So this is a much more complex problem or more complex issue that I've been thinking about a lot. And just to maybe mention, probably many people know that, but there is also a technical limitation to evaluate this because all these models have context window, which is how much text they can sort of not assimilate, but maybe process before stopping making sense. And especially if you want to evaluate very, very long conversation. And I think we saw that in some of the court cases that have been open, like, um, people had this very, very, very long conversation, which seems to indicate that maybe that was sort of like saturated the entire context window of the bot. And so all the built-in safety resources or guardrail failed because of that. And so you can imagine if you have a lot of very long conversation over many months, right? Because again, by looking at all these court cases, it's not that it was an interaction that lasted many months. And so I think that is definitely something we have to figure out how to basically process all these text, all this information, and without losing the nuance of because a human therapist will understand the nuance between like small changes in language that might be a red flag or might indicate that something is going wrong. An LLM is more than happy to summarize a text, but it might lose that kind of nuance. And so how do we do that? And I think it's still an open question for me.
Miranda, before we go to you and sort of tackle the question of how do we regulate all this, I wonder if, Marlene, you had any thoughts about this over time, relational, thing that develops between people and chatbots and how you are noticing this as a clinician.
Yeah, that's a great question, and hearing Luca's thoughts is very helpful because I'm developing right now a drift framework. So the idea that actually over time there's multiple types of drift that happens in these human AI interactions. One being relational drift, another one being identity drift, and another being epistemic, like we're cognitively. There's a new term that just a study out of Wharton just came out with cognitive surrender, that over time we're just outsourcing, not just offloading for productivity, but actually outsourcing unconsciously in a way our human judgment. And so I think the concept of drift, I like that word because it really highlights that this can be a gradual process over a long period of time. And we're seeing in a lot of these cases, it changes and it shifts. Even the fluidity between types of chatbots, like I've heard there was a recent study that came out that showed that people are using Replica, which is usually a companion app for editing purposes and for writing. And so, as we know, people are using ChatGPT for companionship. So it's becoming more fluid. Things are changing over time. I'm seeing it much more in my clinical practice as of a few years ago already. And I have a very small practice, so I'm sure a lot of clinicians are dealing with this. In the psychoanalytic field, there was a new term that came up that I really love called the artificial third. And this idea that it's no longer just the therapist and the client. It's really this third presence where I'll have people coming in and citing AI as a third source, like kind of almost like a second therapist. And we would call this in psychodynamic theory a problem of dilution of transference. So it's now like you have this second therapist in the room. So I think this is a problem we're actively trying to understand.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, even in our study that is ongoing, one of the things that we've noticed is that the longitudinal component is particularly important. We've heard a variety of participants say, oh, I used it, at first as a tool, but then it kind of became a friend. And then I gave it a name, and then it became a therapist. And then, in some cases, it became a romantic partner. So recognizing that roles change over time with these, and oftentimes, they may go between severity levels. Maybe it gets more severe, maybe it gets less severe. This seems to change in the people that we are talking to, at least. Just a broad question, I guess, is what are you seeing generally in the policy landscape right now? So, what kind of regulations are you seeing come up, the degree to which maybe you see them as effective or not? And then, maybe based on that, what kind of changes would you most like to see in the future?
Yeah, there's a couple of very different approaches that we're seeing be explored, and very few of them are in practice yet. And so I don't think we know what will really be effective here. But there's one stream in the area of mental health, which is just to say many states are deliberating about whether therapeutic uses should be banned. And that kind of raises the question of how would you draw a line around that? Is it just tools that are specifically built to be therapeutic supports? Is it any tool that can do that? Is it any tool that does do that? And then raises, I think, the very important question pertaining to the findings you all are having, which is people do find it to be useful. And so does that remove something that's useful? But also, will it actually prevent people from turning to tools to do this? Because AI systems are not just available through large consumer products. A lot of the underlying models are open source. And you could very easily imagine someone spinning up a tool that did this and having that kind of not quite fit into the accountability structures. Some other approaches are prohibitions about claiming to provide therapeutic support or to be a licensed therapist or physician in some way. So more about how the tool is characterized, or at least that a tool has to declare itself to be AI, which I think my understanding is folks tend to know, especially when they're engaging this way. So unclear if that would actually address concerns, but the desire is to at least escape circumstances where someone is pretending to be a human provider and is not. There are overall approaches to incentivizing risk management of AI systems. A lot of that has been focused on so-called systemic or very acute risks that are about, weapons or terrorism or things like that. And too often I see it's overlooking harms that will actually impact people's lives directly, like mental health, although increasingly youth well-being is being looped into that, probably for political reasons, given that there have been some high-profile cases and it's a politically palatable topic for people to think about when trying to regulate technology. Um, and and so whether that will actually get companies to appropriately invest in addressing these issues is a challenge. And then I think underlying to all of this are questions of privacy, and also questions of disclosure. And so my team has studied the increasing amount of personalization that these tools are adopting. So at first if anyone could use it, it generally behaved somewhat similarly. If you put in the same type of question, different answers each time because these are predictive tools, but not tuned to assumptions about the asker. That's been changing. And these tools are remembering conversations over long periods of time, and yet there's no federal privacy law. Not many states have good quality privacy laws. Companies can typically use the data that's collected for any reason that they declare that they are going to use it for, and users don't read the terms and services, the terms of service that define those uses. And so almost all of the major chatbot providers have some ads-driven business model, and there currently is no prohibition on using sensitive, mental, like emotional support related conversations for those purposes. Anthropic has declared that it won't do that, but it's a very competitive landscape, as you said, and it's hard to know for sure like how this will all play out. A couple of companies have tried to kind of get ahead a little bit by saying we're going to provide health specific products or parts of our product for which we'll make more concrete commitments around how we'll use that data. And that's probably from like a user trust perspective, because there's not a requirement that they treat health data any differently. They're not HIPAA covered providers, these platforms, even if people presume that HIPAA covers all health information. It doesn't. It covers health specifically, health providers, health entities, and these platforms are not that. And so there's conversations around whether they should be looped in, whether there should be something that covers health information specifically. But even there, health is, but a part of this, mental health, emotional support, like socio-affective engagement is very fluid. It's a spectrum. Like, where would the line be between, acting like something's a friend versus getting therapeutic support? And I think that's a challenge that these general purpose tools are facing, both from how do you actually build it and how do you test for safety, and also for policymakers, because how do you draw a line for tools that theoretically could be used for multiple purposes. And even if they put a safeguard and try to put filters and say you can use this for homework help or, editing support and not mental support, it might work at first, but as Luca said, over the time, through like over the course of conversations, even the safeguards that exist now can end up weakening and being circumvented. And so it's very, very difficult to build a tool that using these general purpose technologies that will always never engage in a certain type of behavior. And so I think that's something we're all grappling with, is like, how do you tackle this? And a law that just covers tools specifically designed for mental health, I think we all know very clearly will not address the challenges here, because people are turning to the general support tools. And even if they don't intend to, even if they start to use a tool for work purposes or school purposes, we're seeing in some polling my colleagues did in school settings a high correlation between people who use AI systems for school and who start to use it for other purposes. And so it's just a pretty messy space right now, and I don't think we have a good sense of what policy interventions will be effective in addressing the concerns we have, just because A, there are so many, and B, the effectiveness of any of the interventions are still, I think we don't know how they'll play out yet.
Yeah, I mean, and we can't get too much into this, but also there's corporate money, right? So that's, that is kind of the elephant in the room, is as people are using these tools as kind of archives of self and in intimate spaces in their bedrooms and in their homes, they are part of a broader infrastructure of big tech that is kind of pervasive in all our lives. We got a lot of audience questions, so if it's okay with you, we're going to just jump in and The one that that seems to be very popular is this one. I'm a first-time mom to a 2-year-old, and I've been educating myself about adolescents using AI chatbots as their companion. Hence, make that someone somehow not relying to mothers anymore for emotional support. What do you think about this? And what advice do you have for us moms to educate our children in the future about positively using this technology that still protects relationship between mother and child? Marlene, I don't know. That's for everybody, but I'm wondering if the therapist in the room wants to take that.
It's a really thoughtful question, and I think a lot of parents are really actively trying to figure this out. One thing we don't know yet is for teens and young children, how it will shape their relational skills over time if they're primarily interacting with a frictionless type of entity like an AI chatbot, particularly ones that might be more sycophantic, agreeable, always available. Like these features are benefits for why people are using it, but they're also a double-edged sword, so that we don't actually know how that will shape their ability to be able to interact with more tension in real life conflict type situations. There are some early studies that some people are using, and some of this came out in the common sense media study, where teens are using AI in ways to transfer some of their skills. So they're using it for social practice, and they're able to transfer some of that skill set. So, and I will say that therapy chatbots or general purpose chatbots are pretty good at psychoeducation, providing kind of coping skills, some basic emotional support. I think they're not as equipped for kind of deeper work that might require somatic approaches like a trauma. And so I think that just kind of knowing for parents to know what type of chatbot their kids are using, because it really varies, the risk really varies. And to use the parental controls, really just actively have a conversation. Another data point that's helpful for parents is that 1 out of 3 teens that were using AI systems as companions felt like there was something that the AI chatbot said that was either harassing them or a problem. So I think that's an opportunity to have a conversation with our families and family members.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, on that question too, we see a lot of ways in which participants maybe shape their in-person social relationships based on the ways that they interact with a chatbot, and maybe they have certain expectations of how much people should provide, or the ways that they can or can't interact with people. So another question that is upvoted a lot is, I am a chat text suicide crisis counselor with 988. And I noticed a large shift in the ways help seekers who reach out via suggestion of ChatGPT communicate with me over the past year. General impatience, a tendency to project frustration towards me, and disappointment in what the human interaction can and cannot offer. Curious if Marlene can speak to this a little bit more, or anyone else who may have data on mental health chatbots and 988.
There is the Therabot study out of Dartmouth that came out in terms of a mental health chatbot that showed that it could reduce depression and anxiety, but it was developed over several years. And they actually at first the researchers tried to train it on conversations with therapy conversations, but found that that wasn't effective. And they actually needed to create kind of handcrafted, like with clinicians, and train it on those type of responses over time. And they were able to find after 4 weeks, it could reduce some depression and anxiety symptoms. However, this was compared to a wait list. So we need longer term studies, and we need just longer term data. But the crisis work is really, really hard. So I appreciate your work in that space.
Miranda, you were about to say so.
Yeah.
The part of that's interesting about this question is also the frustration with the human helper, right? That seems, which must be very hard to be on the other end of that. So yes, thank you for crisis work. But yeah, Miranda, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to add that, some of us were talking earlier about the fact that when practitioners, AI practitioners think about safety, they're often thinking about the conversation itself and what they can measure about it. And I think what this example demonstrates is the phenomenon that so much of the impact of these things will be offline in other contexts, and it'll be very difficult to both spot trends there, but also get that input back to the folks who are building these tools. And so I think we were talking earlier about how um, if people begin to rely on chatbots for emotional support and disclose that to their friends or family, that their friends and family might not offer empathetic support as much because they think that they're getting that from somewhere else. And so all sorts of interesting and troubling externalities of the support that individuals might feel they're getting in the moment, even if that conversation is entirely non-problematic and super supportive. How might that play out over time, both for that person and for people that they might interact with in their lives? These were not my examples. So if anyone else in the conversation has more examples of that, I think I found that really thought-provoking.
One thing I would like to add to that, like to me, one thing that's interesting is what Miranda said about, how the externalities, like if you're really going to into a world where human relationship are mediated by AI in some capacity, for example, people maybe role-playing conversation or so it will be different, right? Like I'm not saying it's going to be worse. I'm not saying it's going to be better. I'm just saying it's going to be different. And I don't even know how we can measure all these things because again, from the chatbot point of view, these are things that are happening offline, so there is nothing to do there. So we need these sort of like studies that involve really they're going to be very difficult, right? Because you need to involve both the technology and the participants, and over time, and all the people that we talk to. So I think it's sort of another area that we will start hearing and thinking more about.
And one of the challenges with longitudinal studies in this moment is that the technology that people are engaging with in real life changes at least every 3 months, if not faster than that, fundamentally changes. And by the time you get results from a longitudinal study, the system that might have been in question might no longer exist or be relevant. But at the same time, the important observations come through that long amount of time. And so how do we reconcile those needs to make sure that the systems themselves are incorporating those learnings and not kind of cleaving them off as they're updating? And one other challenge with AI systems, especially general purpose ones, is that if you're trying to deal with all sorts of different skills, safety definitions, et cetera, it's quite difficult to optimize for all of those all at the same time, even if you're trying. So if you say, I actually need to fix this thing over here, this other thing might get worse. And so this is sort of a constant effort to make sure that things are all improving and nothing is degrading, and that addressing one community's problem isn't leading to new problems for another community, or fixing safety in the context of eating disorders isn't leading to different types of suicidality. It's they're all interacting. The model itself doesn't differentiate these concepts necessarily. They're all intertwined in a way. And so tweaking a knob can have these unknown effects. And so this is a very dynamic situation.
There's no single metric for safety, basically, which is annoying because that's how people like to do things, right? Like optimizing for one thing.
Yeah, I want to echo that, and I'm curious what the others might think of in terms of solutions for it, if there are any. But like clinically, one of the problems is that depending on the diagnosis or depending on the issue or the symptom, what counts as therapeutic is going to vary. So an example of that, if you have OCD and you are having a constant fear and you need reassurance, it's actually not very therapeutic to constantly reassure that person. And we actually teach partners to like how to separate and how to help that person self-regulate and distract or move to something else. So that's an example where constant validation is actually counter to therapeutic goals. As opposed to someone who might need a little bit more reassurance because of their history. So it really will vary, and so I think that's one of the challenging things. I also wanted to return to that question about the frustrations that people are noticing with the 988 suicide hotline. It's interesting because on a clinical level for therapy, I am noticing that for people who are using it a lot for emotional use, they start to think of empathy and validation as equivalent to therapy, and that the therapy is really a combination of challenge and support. And so I wonder over time if we will see in some spaces for some people that there will become a little bit more of an expectation that what therapy looks like, or what for them, they feel like is supportive, is more what AI delivers, which is empathy, agreeability, as opposed to a more hybrid approach of challenge and support. So I think there's an open question there for research.
I have two responses to each of those points. One was another example of where what might work for some folks might not work for others, or the circumstances may change. Is in my team's research on eating disorders, one of the examples that came up quite a bit from the experts was that generalized health advice can be quite harmful to people who are navigating an eating disorder, saying, how many calories is it healthy to eat in a day, or like how can I exercise or something like that. In general, that might be totally appropriate, but for someone suffering from an eating disorder or recovering from one, it might not be the right way to respond to what would otherwise seem to be a benign question. And how would a platform know that without knowing a lot about the person, which raises privacy questions. So some definitely tangled issues there. On the question of expectations that people have, I had a point and now it fled my mind. Yes, that platforms, and I've talked to developers at some of these companies, and they've really been grappling with, should we actively try to improve the performance of our tool for some sensitive purpose like health or mental health? Or, you could imagine developing like a skill, Claude has skills now, or plugins or something that allow these models to navigate mental health, with more nuance. And yet that plays into the regulatory conversation, because you might say, well, if you've actively gone out of your way to make it work in this space, you should be responsible for what happens. And then it sort of disincentivizes potentially the improvement in these sensitive areas, because there's a heightened expectation of potentially liability even. And we don't know how that'll play out. So there's no one's wanting to kind of move too quickly there. But at the same time, that might be leaving room for various types of harms to come about, because no one wants to be on the hook for it.
Yeah, I wonder if we can. Oh, Luca, yeah, I was gonna go to the kind of design perspective. So take it away.
I'll just add something real quick that to what Miranda said is like, also if companies or organization wants to sort of improve a certain type of skill or outcome, these things are not very easy to define and require a lot of time and care and a lot of expertise from a subject matter expert. And let's say maybe tech company have not been the most patient, they move fast, break thing type mentality. And so would they want to do a study or a project that maybe is on the longer term? And I think Miranda was also mentioning earlier, like the technology, like you might do something, but then in 6 months, what the technology will look like might be very different. So I think there's also this sort of like incentive and time horizon that are really challenging. And there's a lot of, I mean, in fairness, there's a lot of market pressure. So there's a lot of component that are make this very hard in practice when you look at how a company operates, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and oh, Briana, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can respond. And then I had another question that I think Luca. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we are seeing more of lately are the ad features. And Miranda got at this very briefly, but I do want to get your perspective on this. These chatbots are oftentimes embedded into venture-backed mental health platforms, right, or general purpose platforms. And these platforms rely on technical metrics, things like engagement, things like retention for growth. And then, of course, you see the ad features there to generate some of that revenue. So I'm wondering broadly, how are you thinking about the tension, or how are you seeing the tension being talked about in your field behind, designing emotional support features that maybe drive corporate incentives, right? Versus designing them to genuinely prioritize user well-being?
So from what I've seen, like my company does not really plan to have any ads anytime soon. So I think, this discussion is I've not been privy to much of it. I also want to say that when companies say, "Hey, trust us," we swear that our product will not be become worse because we're adding ads. Is going to be, the answer you get will not be um, made worse because we want to run ads. We actually have evidence in the past that quite the opposite happened when Google started the famous original paper said there should be no ads in a search engine because this is not what serving user in the best way. And then at some point they added ads, and then there was sort of like a famous struggle within the company if the search result should be the best or should be improved so that people will click more. So point being, at the end of the day, even if they say the product will not be enshittified, everything gets enshittified. So that's I want to say I'm very jaded. But in general, we have to put a lot of trust in companies' public pledge, and these pledges are all non-binding. And as we saw, I think maybe Briana mentioned like earlier this week, companies are always they're one-sided. They always can walk back and decide that their pledge is now weaker or not anymore.
And there's a convoluted logic that gets employed, which is that if there was an assertion that a company wouldn't use ads and then they want to start, they'll start making the argument that, well, in order to maintain access for this very valuable service for people who can't afford it, what should we do? This will help people maintain access. We want to democratize this technology. Ads, and so that's on one hand of like this is actually necessary to support people access. The second like version of that argument, or sort of level two of that argument is, in fact, ads are good for people because they're helping advertisers connect with people who really would benefit from their services and really want them. And in fact, engagement with ads demonstrates that. And so I've seen this logic kind of go over and over, and people kind of become, very grounded in it. Some even believe it that like the value of the free service is so high that ads are worth price worth paying, and that ads themselves are valuable. And I have found interesting products through ads, as have many people. So like there's something to it. People they'll question it. They're like, oh, I guess maybe like it's not terrible. But then I think everyone is aware at the moment that injecting ads into this modality, which hasn't had them before, will undermine trust, and they are worried about that. So they are trying to be very conscientious at some level in the way in which they introduce ads, because if they do it too quickly and wrong, they'll destroy a lot of potential value in the future. But also that I think there's an assumption about what ads are, that they are like valuable and just products and whatnot. But ads can also be abused, especially if you have a large scale advertising operation where a platform is not providing editorial discretion about what is advertised, but just allowing advertisers to, bid on undefined audiences, or audiences most likely to engage with a particular piece of content in some unlabeled machine learning driven way. There are a lot of people who try to abuse that, people who are trying to generate leads, mental health clinics that are for profit, drug recovery clinics and things like that, can make a lot of money out of people going to those places. And so some states have laws that prohibit the generation of leads, or like the selling of potential clients to these places, but not all. So you could certainly see people trying to take advantage of all the data that these platforms will have on people's proximity to, some need for mental health or any other type of service, a predatory loan, low quality education, things like that, that can be like the dark underbelly of ads, even when it's potentially a best case scenario. But I will say there have been a lot of claims lately about from the platform saying, well, we're not optimizing for engagement like the social medias of the past. It's totally different. We're optimizing for quality. But for, the signals of quality typically are, do you come back? Because that might mean you found value. And so you have to really dig into that and say, well, exactly how are you measuring that? Because is that really so different than engagement? Maybe it's not every click, and maybe you're not engaging for like the rapid response sort of pinwheel gambling version of engagement, but it is still, are you coming back? Are you continuing to pay your monthly $20? That's obviously you find value in it if you're paying us for it, and that means that you're getting some kind of response that you're finding useful. And to Marlene's point, if what you're finding useful is just sort of a yes man or sycophancy or even good quality empathetic support, that still might not be what is in the long run the right thing that people need in that moment, especially when we're talking about mental health.
Since we were talking about sort of, Luca, you were talking about the jadedness, which is, I'm wondering if we can, in the last few minutes, talk about, I think solutions is a too simple of a word, but things that can be done therapeutically, technically, legislatively. And there's so many questions in the chat here, but also, right, this is also about the infrastructure of care and the infrastructure of how society is, arranged more broadly. So I wonder if we could kind of imagine alternative futures that are not as not as jaded as we conclude, sort of.
I think that I have hope that, especially in talking with teens and young people, that as we understand how these systems operate, our informed stance, our AI literacy is a layer of protection. And so I think as people become more aware of how these chatbots are trained, their sycophantic nature, the aspect of drift, like how the guardrails that are in place and not in place. Like I think as we become more informed, I do have hope that that will add a layer of protection. In and of itself is not enough, but I do think that it will empower people to be able to use it in a way that hopefully will be more informed and beneficial. So.
I would say that there are three types of approaches that I think could be helpful. They're not visionary approaches, but they're functional approaches. And so one is that a lot of these tools will take instructions, right, in their system prompt. How would you like me to behave with you? Or through things like skills. I could imagine that some set of experts developing, like, what would it mean to give an instruction sheet to an AI system for how to actually provide positive kind of therapeutic support. Some people might take advantage of that, knowing, like, they might know that the off-the-shelf tool is not the best and want some kind of resource, but not actually know how to do that. And they might be improvising at the moment. So that could be interesting. I don't think the platforms will do it for themselves because of like the questions of liability I mentioned earlier, but a lot of these are sort of just things people are posting on the internet of like, here's how I do it. So what might it look like to kind of share resources with people who are using these tools to do a little bit more to shape the model's behavior? It's not perfect. Models drift again, even when you give them instructions, but that could help. The second is, as Luca mentioned, one of the key ways that developers are thinking about both risks and capabilities of their systems are evaluations. And so experts, mental health experts, practitioners, I think it would be really interesting to have even deeper involvement in building out, like, what would an evaluation for the types of use cases or harms that I'm seeing in my practice or in the field look like to support folks who are like embedded like Luca, or even to kind of publish publicly and get in the literature for the AI labs to say, like, this is actually a clinically validated evaluation, or one that's inspired by clinical best practice, or a more nuanced sense of harm, I think would be quite additive to the space. Often I find that there's some skepticism in engaging in that practice because it feels reductive, or it's oversimplifying some sense of safety or harm or behavior, and that's probably true. And yet, those are the tools that these companies are using to prioritize their work, to know if they're making good progress. And so like, how do we find that happy medium of like nudging them in the right direction while also not conceding that that's the metric to optimize for? And then finally, I think, while entirely insufficient, I do think that some ability for people to like indicate that in this conversation, I'm engaging in a way that I would really like for you platform to not use for any of the other things you're using your data for. Like it's really not enough, but the fact that they've done it for physical health suggests that it's possible to do. And so, and people are not using these, in coherent sessions necessarily, but to the extent that they would like to, that seems totally reasonable of a thing to offer and should, could be a foundation for stronger baselines and guarantees over time as we kind of figure out where those boundaries lie. Again, it's like, but a drop in the bucket, but it's something they're already exploring. And so why not think about how to expand that?
I'll add a small thing to that. I think, being hopeful when, these tools were created, like OpenAI did not realize that ChatGPT was such a popular or would become such a popular thing, right? Like just quite released as a research prototype of some sort. And so when the tool was developed, I believe it was mostly sort of like technical people trying to optimize for whatever loss metric, et cetera, et cetera. But now the reason I'm saying that is because now I'm hopeful that people have realized that, because we start using these tools for a lot of other things, company have started getting experts to better respond to specific parts. And so, there is examples where industry-led standards become the de facto safety standards for things. And, going back to the example of air travel I mean earlier, but um, we kind of need to speed run, as I was saying earlier, like this part. But now it seems that companies have been more interested in just getting other experts in the room to maybe respond or like to figure out what is the best way of answering certain queries, or like what are some topics that should not be touched, or if there's like a human handoff, when does the human handoff happen? And so I think that mixture of expertise is something that gives me hope.
Thank you, Luca. Yeah, that was very similar to the thing that I think comes to mind for Livia and I for our research, which is truly just the demand for and the need to include people who are actually using these systems in the work at all levels, right? Some of the things that we've heard in our research, right, are things like I feel really empowered to participate in these things. I feel like I'm heard. I feel like I had a way in to provide feedback beyond kind of this, A/B testing with the upvote, downvote. So yeah, and I think it's important to just note that users are also experts in their own way, and oftentimes they are the experts that we need to be listening to. So thank you.
Yeah, we're coming up on time, but yeah, echoing sort of what Briana said in the spirit of this panel, the research that we've done, but also the workshop that actually this panel is part of, that is a closed workshop, but we're trying to put different people in the same rooms to have conversations and kind of riff. And yes, lived experience voices are important. I'm an anthropologist, so that's kind of what I do. But I think, Brianna and I come from different fields, but have really benefited from the interdisciplinary conversations around this. I know there's so many questions that we did not answer. I encourage anybody to reach out to our project email, which I can put again in the chat. It's healthteam@dataandsociety.net. It seems like a lot of people wanted to connect with each other, so we can facilitate some of that. So I think that brings us to the end of this webinar, perhaps more conversations to come. Thank you, panelists, for a great discussion. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today. Thank you to our producers, to Nika and Rigo, for always being our fearless leaders, and gratitude to truly our participants from our research that have spent months with us talking about their experiences and trusting us with this. So we're very grateful. To learn about Data and Society, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can follow us on Blue Sky. And I think that's all. Take care, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.